Hi, I'm Alex Grossman. I'm an alumni of the University of Colorado at Boulder, where I studied international affairs and anthropology. I'd like to welcome you today to a mini-series of panels hosted by the Conference on World Affairs and the International Affairs Subcommittee. This first panel is going to focus on climate change, the most pressing issue of our time. Unfortunately, time is running out to address this challenge, which is why our panel of experts is here to advise on some solutions and potential next steps. Every single person on Earth plays an important role in addressing the climate crisis, and I hope that this panel offers some important takeaways for each and every one of us in protecting both people and planet. Thanks, and enjoy the panel.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. And thank you for joining the CU Boulder Conference on World Affairs virtual panel, Climate Change, Creating a More Comfortable, Sustainable, and Safer World for All. This is a three-part series focused on international affairs during the new presidential administration. You may submit questions at any time during the session, either through the Zoom Q&A feature or on YouTube chat. And please share if you're a CU student and the location from where you're joining. My name is Keja Atye-Reese. I'll be your moderator today. I'm the Vice President of External Relations at Global Green Grants Funds, which funds about 1,000 grants a year to grassroots movements throughout the world, which are working on just and sustainable solutions to our most pressing environmental and social justice issues. And since today's panel will dive deeply into many heady discussions, I'm going to launch us by weaving the heart into it a bit with a short poem by Rabindranath Tagore. Though it's called Let My Country Awake, the words ring true both for our world and certainly the theme of our discussion. And then I will introduce the panelists. Where the mind is without fear and the head held high, where knowledge is free, where the world has not been broken up into fragments by narrow domestic walls, where the words come out from depth of truth, where tireless striving stretches its arms towards perfection, where the clear stream of reason has not lost its way into the dreary desert sand of dead habit, where the mind is led forward by thee into ever-widening thought and action, into that heaven of freedom, let my country awake. That's Rabindranath Tagore. Today, we bring a global view to climate change with climate leaders from Mexico, South Africa, and the United States. And Mahanda Rodriguez-Aja, who is to join us from FRIDA, the Young Feminist Fund, has been sick and deeply regrets that she will not be able to be here, but make sure to visit youngfeministfund.org to learn more about FRIDA's and Mahanda's global feminist organizing. We are lucky and grateful that Lara Garcia was able to jump in and take Mahandra's place. Thank you, Lara. Lara Garcia is president and CEO of Global Green Grants Fund. She's a Mexican feminist and has advocated for human rights, social justice, and civil society throughout her career. Before joining Global Green Grants Fund, Lara served for 7 years as the executive director of Fondos Semillas, a Mexican nonprofit that finances grassroots organizations to achieve gender equality. Lara has vast experience in grassroots philanthropy, human rights, and movements for social justice, and she has co-created networks to promote global community philanthropy in the global South. We also have Bill McKibben. Bill is the founder of 350.org and a Schumann Distinguished Scholar in Environmental Studies at Middlebury College. His 1989 book, The End of Nature, is believed to be one of the first for a general audience about climate change and has been translated into 24 languages. He's written many more books, and his work appears regularly in periodicals from the New Yorker to Rolling Stones. He serves as a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and he won the Gandhi Peace Prize, as well as honorary degrees from 19 colleges and universities. Foreign Policy named him to its inaugural list of the world's 100 most important global thinkers. And Bill, I understand you now also have a woodland gnat bearing your name as well. And we also have Bobby Peake. Bobby is the director of Groundwork in South Africa. Bobby is an activist addressing the layers of environmental justice issues facing South Africa in the post-apartheid era and increasingly doing work that extends through Southern Africa. Bobby has worked tirelessly with local community groups to ameliorate the severe pollution problems in the South Durban region, where industry and residents are side by side. In 1998, Bobby received the Goldman Prize for uniting the Durban communities against polluting industry in South Durban. He advises on various national and international environmental justice strategies, and he's an advisor and on the board of directors of Global Green Grants Fund. Well, we are facing immense challenges in our world. Drs. Ayanna Johnson and Catherine Wilkinson write in their climate anthology, All We Can Save, it is a magnificent thing to be alive in a moment that matters so much. Today, our panelists will share more about why this very moment is so critical and what you can do about it. We will start opening remarks addressing climate change, creating a more comfortable, sustainable, and safe forward for all with Lara, then Bobby, and end with Bill. Lara, you have the floor.
Thank you, Keisha. Can you hear me well? Okay. So there's nothing more at the center of the climate crisis right now than free market neoliberalism. We need a radical solution because we have procrastinated too long. We have run out of other options. So we are looking ahead into radical solutions. And the economic system has captured all of our imagination. So we have romanticized or idealized capitalism and the economic system of today. And yet, ironically, we also warn about idealizing too much alternatives of communal life, agroecology, traditional medicine, etc. But we need to romanticize the system of capitalism and free market in order to make it bearable, because we have to be honest here, and even independently of the climate crisis, the truth of the matter is that the capitalist system of today is not working for the majority of the world. So we have set up a system to idealize that, and that has captured the imagination of thinking about other alternatives, of imagining other futures. And that, for me, is the principal value of feminism. Feminism lets us recuperate that imagination and lets us build a path or a roadmap towards the replenishment and renewing of the systems and of society. We cannot really push the solutions to the climate crisis by only saying that our lives are at risk. We need to build something that's more positive than that in order to move humans to rebuild our societies entirely. Because again, as I mentioned before, we need that radical solution. We have run out of other options right now. And we cannot really, we are not going to be able to do much in society if whatever we are doing right now is about just letting people know that our lives are at risk and that we're running out of time. So feminism, for me, the most important thing of what feminism and the feminist movement can provide to the climate crisis and to the climate justice movement is that it brings value because it has studied for long patriarchy and capitalism that have placed women in a subordinate position to invisibly sustain those systems with their work. Likewise, ecofeminism has shown us that capitalism has also exploited nature in very similar ways to sustain our modes of production. So as a response, one of the added values of feminism to the conversation is that the economy of care, for example, has highlighted the importance of bringing light and giving economic value to life, and giving economic value to care and to things that our own capitalist system has made invisible. It has also shown us the economy of care, of feminist economy and feminism in general, that we created those systems, and because we created and humans created those systems, we are perfectly capable of creating something else, of destroying that system or reconstructing it, to give life its biggest value, and to give value to everything that we know is right now key to making us move towards climate justice. In order to change the whole system, we need to understand also the interconnectedness of human systems of oppression and the causes that have got us to where we are today. This intersectionality, which has been a core contribution of feminist thinking, only helps us understand the linkages and helps us understand the causes better. And understanding the causes better, we know that that is helpful for solutions. But I think that another great contribution of interconnectivity of those systems is that we can also help start thinking about building what Naomi Klein calls a big tent of all social movements getting together to start solving the climate crisis. We need that. We need the interconnection of different social systems to be able to build a very big agenda that can encompass all the social justice agendas to help ensure that we have more population and that we have more powerful force to be able to move towards change. So one of the things that we have been observing in the world is the huge power that has been brought up by the feminist and youth movements. They are demonstrating to be in the center of the attention of the public lately. And that is something that the climate justice movements have been, can take advantage of. I think that in general, the social movements sort of behave like quantum physics. They are sometimes static or quiet, and suddenly they rise and they multiply and they reproduce in different areas of the world, or they spark different local movements. And we don't really know what determines that. We just know that we need to keep trying, that we need to take from other social movements like the Black Lives Matter movement, for example, for racial justice, and bring it to the center of the table of the climate justice movement as well. Because we know that if we continue doing that, we'll get the grassroots movements to become to have the necessary energy to spark change all over. And we know that also financing and supporting these movements when they are latent or when they are quiet to the public eye are as important as supporting them once they have risen to the attention of everyone. And I think that one of the most challenging things for grassroots movements, independently of their agendas, is that they're very often quiet to this other lens of our world, which is captured by mainstream media, which is the culture that also tends to romanticize power, to idealize whatever is in the public eye, but then tends to disregard whatever is not yet seen in newspapers or media. And we have the power to overturn that, but we need to pay a lot of attention to what communal life and the many organizations and grassroots communities have been demonstrating about working for a long time under systems that are creating these alternatives. And these alternatives should not be romanticized, should not be idealized, should not be accused to be too idealistic or too romantic, because they are actually at the center of providing the solutions for all of our system. We need to bring light to these movements. We need to bring light into what they are already demonstrating for us. And they are demonstrating that, for example, indigenous communal life and communal ways of collectively making decisions and protecting forests and protecting land have been the strongest legal and social barriers against extractives. So we have something to pay attention to there. And just as a comparison, we are dealing right now at the macro level with systems such as the World Trade Organization, who has hampered consecutively and systematically any efforts towards rebuilding any alternatives to the free market that can bring about, for example, green energy. And if we think about the impossibility that that has represented, and together with the possibility that grassroots movements are representing two solutions, we might be able to shift our focus and give grassroots movements much more importance than what they have right now in climate negotiations, as well as the public eye and the all of the debates and conversations about climate crisis. Grassroots movements are actually providing for us all of these alternative modes or solutions, but we need to make sure that the imagination that has been captured by our culture of free market and capitalism, we need to rethink that. We need to understand at least that we have been sequestered by a mode of thinking that lets us know that there's no other way to live than the way that we're living right now. And that is a lie. I think that corporate power is continuing to push that more and more, but we have to be smart. We have the possibility to look at what is already being showcased by in the world, which is the power of grassroots social movements to create regenerative economies and other solutions to the climate crisis. I'm going to leave it there, Keisha, and but I'm very open to other questions.
Wonderful, thank you, Lara. Bobby.
Thanks, Keisha, and thanks to the Conference on World Affairs and Colorado University and GGF, Global Green Grants Fund. And I just want to, my talk will be about a just transition, and it's the important concept of rebuilding our society, as Lara has just mentioned. So Groundwork is an environmental justice organization, and we are based in South Africa and work across Africa. And critically, environmental justice for Groundwork is about empowered people in relations of solidarity and equity with each other, and in a non-degrading and positive relationship with their environment. Note, it's about a set of relationships, and that for us is very important when one talks about environmental justice. If there's no equity amongst people, there is going to be no environmental justice. For our sins, recently, Groundwork was appointed onto the Presidential Climate Change Coordination Commission to be able to look at South Africa's climate change response, as well as a just transition, so that we can move towards a low carbon economy. Evidence of climate change abounds. There are still skeptics out there, we know that, but the reality is for all to see. But it's climate change, and what drives climate change is also violent. And people are dying because they are saying no to fossil fuels. Just in October last year, we lost Mafikile Nshangase, a grandmother who questioned the expansion of a coal mine in South Africa. And that's what we faced. Somebody walked into our house and shot her 5 times because she did not want a coal mine, we believe. Climate change is a very personal issue for me. I lived next to an oil refinery for many years and suffered from asthma. And I watch friends, I watch family, people passing away around me because of the first impacts of climate change, and that's the toxics that many grassroots communities, many fence-line communities breathe in every day. Bill has been watching climate change for many years, and he's eloquent about that, and he will speak more, I assume, on the impacts and on the reasons for. But I think for us in the South, and it's critical that we can't go into communities with a climate change debate and say, let's deal with climate change. They look at you and they say, climate change? No, what communities need and what communities campaign within the South is about service delivery. And unless we link climate change to service delivery and to be able to fight poverty and environmental justice about food and bring food on the table, it's still going to be a very weak debate in the South. We're just about to release a publication on people on the front lines of coal, COVID, and the climate crisis. And we need to recognize that the climate crisis is part of a broader ecological crisis created, as Laura said, by global capitalism and its devotion to profit and growth. it's all about economic growth. And the COVID crisis emerges from the rent in the web of life. And while climate change is slow, a slow motion wreck, the impacts of COVID is very acute. It's very now, weeks, months, and a year or two. And that's showing us what is going to happen when climate change hits us. The ecological disturbance because of climate change and how it's going to impact upon the world and people. And we need to recognize that as we, the baleful of fires of pandemic have illuminated and widened the fault lines, as we have seen the pandemic, we have seen how it exposed inequality, poverty, and hunger. So what we're calling is for a just transition. Groundwork has been calling for this since 1999, for 22 years now. We've called for a deep transformation of the way the world works. Largely, that transformation must be driven by movements of the poor, by the dispossessed, and by the wretched of the earth. And for the most part, we have tried to keep that real, to recognize that power of the forces of repression, but also the instability of that power. Power is not there forever. And when that power is challenged, and when that power is broken, movements must be able to step into that space very speedily. In terms of renewable energy and in terms of a just transition, we also say that the real possibility that alternative energy sources, technologies, and applications might be taken up by the masses of the poor in a project that they define and drive lies in connecting the promise of renewables with movements struggling for a deep transformation of the way the world works. We cannot divorce the two. To be able to make a change, to be able to stop climate change, system change has to happen. And that is really critical. So over the years, we have called for that repeatedly, and on our website, you can find many reports about that. But we've done that in dialogue with communities. And we've come to the following 8 points. The following points on a just transition after many years of dialogue and writing. And we believe this is the solution, and this is a response to climate change. We need a new energy system. A new energy system, also called a just energy transition, is at the core of the debate. It requires alliances and coalition building, which has become a broad social movement, as Lara has said. We have to have a broad tent. We have to bring everybody in, experts and economists, to support our positions. Bill can speak, eloquently about how 350 has started a campaign to stop the financing of fossil fuels, and it's been very successful in building that campaign globally. And that is critical. We have to stop fossil fuel investment, and we have to build alliances to ensure that happens. And we have to build in the system a challenge to corporate so there is accountability. And we also have to stop multilateral banks for impoverishing the South by their continual investment in fossil fuel projects. We have to recognize that we have to decommission these plants, these old oil refineries, these coal-fired power plants, but also we have to rehabilitate and restore the land. And communities around the world are rehabilitating already mine-affected lands by themselves, because often divestment, the opposite point to divestment is that companies run away and then they leave toxic lands for people. We have to think of living with climate impacts. This area of a just transition contains urgent planning and practical assistance to ensure that local municipalities have the systems to respond to mass migration as a result of climate disaster. Municipalities are at the forefront of this challenge, and they have to do this in an open and democratic way. And we have to build resilience to ensure that the chaos of climate change is responded to effectively by the poor. Health is immensely important. Groundwork started off from a health perspective, from a health campaign. And we need to recognize that today in South Africa, more than 2,300 people die every year because of our coal-fired pollution. Because of coal-fired pollution, $2.3 billion are lost in our economy every year. And the government allows this by allowing companies to transgress the law, to break the law by giving them legal status to not meet health-based standards. And finally, we have to also, in the health component, fix the broken health systems that are so prevalent in the global South. And COVID has exposed this. transportation and communication, changes in transport from fossil fuels to the public system is important, but sadly, railway systems in Africa are very poor. Communication issues are critical, and as we build up and as we see how we have to be online as a result of COVID, we need to recognize that online means closing democratic spaces. Food and food sovereignty is critical. The way food is produced in the world and how to decorporatize food is critical. Food also involves political economy, gender issues, social justice issues, and these are critical issues of our time. And we have to be able to we have to take over this food system as people and involve the self-provision of food. We have to engage with informal street traders and informal economies, and that's really critical. And then finally, local service delivery is critical in a just transition. We cannot talk about a just transition without the delivery of energy services, without the delivery of decent settlements, without the delivery of the importance of a social wage, water, waste removal. And local government is key at that level. And it has to be done in an open democratic manner, in what we call open democracy. And finally, what do we mean by open democracy? And we must remember in South Africa, in the government of Mandela from 1994 to 1999, we as society had access to government meetings, access to permits, access to minutes. We don't have access any longer. And the closing democratic spaces are happening violently, and the system is closing in on us, and we have to open that up. Thank you.
Bobby, thank you for that. And Bill.
Well, thank you all. What a pleasure to get to join in here. And really, Laura and Bobby have already provided an immense amount of the kind of meat of this discussion. And what they're saying is so crucially important that we have to, that in an emergency is precisely the moment to try and think about what things look like coming out of that emergency, how you make big, deep changes. I've gotten to write a little bit about this kind of thing over the years. There's a book of mine, Deep Economy, that tries to address some of these questions. But today, since they've done such a good job, let me just provide a little bit of almost background here to supplement what they've been saying. Let me just give you a sense of how fast we need to act and how much, and then a few hints about where that might be. Because it is important always to remember what an emergency we're in. You know, the world came together in Paris in 2015, the Paris Climate Accords. The Paris Climate Accords are not very good. The promises that various governments made were pretty paltry and limited. But the great part of the Paris Climate Convention was the preamble, where the countries of the world announced that they were going to try and hold the increase in global temperature to 1.5 degrees. That was a huge victory for activists, especially from the global south, from Africa and low-lying island nations whose chant had been, and I remember the first time it was heard at Copenhagen, but whose chant had been for some years, 1.5 to stay alive. And by getting that number in the preamble, they completely refocused the way that the world thought about climate change and how fast and how much we needed to act. So the climate scientists taking that number told us in 2018 that if we hadn't fundamentally transformed the world's energy systems by 2030, which they defined as cutting emissions in half, then our chance of meeting that target that we set in Paris would go by forever. And that concentrates the mind to have that kind of deadline on, based on purely physics and chemistry. And it especially concentrates the mind when we look around the world and see how much damage we're already doing, even though we haven't quite reached that mark yet. We're just above 1.0 degrees Celsius. And even at that, we've lost half the sea ice in the summer Arctic. We see wildfires from Australia to South America to Siberia to California like we've never seen before. We have just, the worst hurricane season in the Atlantic that we've ever measured. And of course, all those things are doing incredible damage to real people, especially to real people who've done very little to cause the crisis they find themselves in. I was especially struck by the fact that the last two hurricanes of this past Atlantic season crashed into Central America, devastating. Nicaragua, Honduras. We think that the damage in Honduras, the economic damage, may be equivalent to 40% of the country's GDP. So by comparison, the worst natural disaster, in American history was when Hurricane Katrina struck 15 years ago or so, and that did damage equivalent to about 1% of our GDP. The iron law of climate change is the less you did to cause it, the sooner and the harder you get hit. So the question becomes, one of the questions becomes, how do we keep that from getting any worse than it has to get? How do we make the kind of rapid change that we need in the very short period of time that physics and chemistry allows us? And we can talk about 1,000 different things, but both Bobby and Laura pointed to what I think is one of the really key interventions. We talk a lot about the role of government, and government's really important, but let's talk about the role about capitalism, and especially about capital, the thing that drives it. I was thinking about it today because it was a year ago today, back in the blissful, innocent era before we all had to wear masks and stay at home. I spent this day a year ago getting arrested in the lobby of Chase Manhattan Bank, the one nearest the US Capitol in Washington, DC. And we were there, a few of us, because Chase is the single biggest lender to the fossil fuel industry in the world. Since the Paris Climate Accords, they've handed over $250 billion to the fossil fuel industry. We didn't need Donald Trump to sabotage the Paris Accords, though he certainly did his best. Chase and Bank of America and Wells Fargo and Barclays and Standard and all the other banks were doing their best to do the same thing. And so standing up to those guys is really important. We've run this divestment campaign now for the better part of a decade. Naomi Klein and I kind of dreamed it up, and it got much bigger than we ever thought it would. We're at about $15 trillion now in endowments and portfolios divesting from fossil fuel. It was modeled, of course, on the work that Desmond Tutu and so many others did during the apartheid era to win divestment from banks and other corporations engaged in apartheid. But this is having similar effect. Last year, Shell Oil in its annual report said that divestment had become a material risk to its business, which is good because Shell Oil's business is a material risk to everything on planet Earth. One of the reasons I'm most hopeful about the Biden administration is I think that they've put in place a number of people who will help make it easier to push the financial system hard through the Federal Reserve, through the Treasury Department, through the Securities and Exchange Commission, the other arms of the US government that interact with big money. And I think that's one of the places we're going to have to continue to push very, very hard. I'm glad that we have this broad coalition, at least in North America, called Stop the Money Pipeline, that really grew out of the fight over the Dakota Access Pipeline and over the work of indigenous activists who started in on this tactic of going after banks and insurance companies and asset managers. And I think it's going to be really important going forward to try and this is one of the big levers we have to push, and push real hard. So, I'm old, and I think I tend to think about the things that we have to do in the very short run in order to hand over to the next generation of people fighting this fight a world where there's enough physical coherence that's not so destroyed that they won't be able to continue this fight and build some of the wonderful things that Laura and Bobby have been discussing, and that really are the hope if we manage to rise to this particularly brutal occasion.
Bill, thank you. We're going to have a group discussion, and then we'll open it briefly for some questions from the audience. So I see that some questions are coming, but please continue. Bill, I just want to continue a little bit on what you were just saying, because about the Biden-Harris administration, and given the destruction of the environment that Trump has so focused on during the last 4 years, including support of corporations and profit at all costs and on, and the time that we lost with him, what will Biden and Harris truly be able to do to address the climate crisis? And what are the most important things for them to focus on? And what global leadership does the US need to play right now?
Well, those are all good, deep, hard questions. I think that there are limits to how much they can do. The United States remains very politically divided. And I don't know how much legislation they'll actually be able to push through the US Senate. I know that they're going to try, and it's obviously very important, both in terms of COVID recovery and climate prevention, to build out renewable energy systems really fast. I mean, that's at the very bottom what Green New Deal work is, a lot of it is about. It's not the only thing it's about. But I think that they'll try to do that. I think that they're going to try and use executive orders, bypassing Congress, to get accomplished as much as they can. And I was very happy to see, for personal reasons if nothing else, the earliest of these executive orders was one finally canceling the Keystone Pipeline after 10 long, hard years of battle. I'm very happy not to have to ever mention the phrase again, much less have to go to jail ever again about it. And the coalition that it built was really crucial in the rise of a climate movement that stretched across grassroots and indigenous groups and everybody else. So for that, it's really good, but I'm glad it's over. I think that they're serious about about a global approach. And I think they indicated that by appointing John Kerry, the former Secretary of State, as the global climate envoy. That certainly implies that Biden puts a lot of, there's a lot of gravitas that comes with that. But I don't know whether or not that kind of global coalition is buildable, whether, how deep the rifts between China and the US and other big emitters are, and whether one can figure out how to bridge them. I think that the meetings in Glasgow will be really important. But in the end, I don't think any of the political maneuvering can work without the kind of huge movement building continuing that we've been doing. Because in the end, I think on questions of this scale, and there's only a few things that ever reached this scale, on questions of this scale, the job of activists above all is to change the zeitgeist, to change the sense of what people think is normal and natural and obvious. And I think that's what Laura was talking about to some degree, with this sense of, what's inevitable and what we keep being told. When we can change the zeitgeist, our sense of what's normal and natural and obvious, then legislation and other things follow much more easily. And so for me, every fight about pipelines, about banks, about divestment, about all of that, they're all important in their own right, but they're really important to the degree that they're able to shift that zeitgeist, that sense of where we're headed.
Very important. Thank you, Bill. And on that note, Lara, I think this is also a good time for kind of myth busting about the feminist approach. And many still hear the word feminist and think it does not include men, or if they don't identify as a feminist, that it does not include them. And you were talking earlier about some of the importance of feminism in addressing the climate crisis. Can you talk a little bit about how we need to change the narrative and how is the feminist approach inclusive and really critical right now?
Thank you, Keisha. I think that connected to what Bill was just saying, the feminist movement has been questioned around the same grounds than the climate justice movement is questioned on providing and proposing solutions like Bobby's list that he was just mentioning, because it's really about the zeitgeist that Bill mentioned. What I mean by that is that it's very difficult for us to deconstruct our heads and basically think about a more equal world, because we have been taught to think that these differences, that these disparities, that these inequality and injustices are natural, and that the natural differences, the biological differences of men and women have been translated into social differences that we invented as humans. But there's a narrative challenge there, because it's so ingrained in our system, it's so normalized, that it's very difficult to think outside the box. Like I said before, these systems of oppression have captured our imagination to a point where we cannot think outside of it. It's very difficult for us to imagine solutions to a climate crisis that is at the core of the systems that we have created. If it was a climate crisis that was disconnected to the very own structure, to the main structure that sustains our means of production and our form of life right now, it would have been easily solvable. We would have had no problem on doing it. But because it's really about changing the way that we think, and I want to challenge the audience in thinking that, in my opinion, the real challenge for us right now is not to address the climate deniers. I think it's much more to address our own denial in thinking differently about these systems, about the fact that we created gender inequality in the very same way that we created social and economic inequalities that are at the core of environmental degradation. And the solutions are much more close, in my mind, are much more close to communal life, alternative forms of living, and that invisible care work that I was talking about, and getting things done collectively without much of a story of single heroes, epic battle climaxes that we tend to think about in our own system of thinking and culture in liberal democracies, for example, the public emotions about victorious struggles that we see, for example, in Biden taking over in the US right now. It's a story about an epic battle of a single man almost, and it's very different to what indigenous communities tell us about political power, for example, about sharing power and being able to provide solutions and to protect together something. And I think that part of the culture, we need to think about it more, because it's in all of our imagination. It's not just the climate deniers that are putting this battle against and that are really the most responsible for not providing solutions yet. I think that we all as society bear a responsibility, because we're still thinking or trapped in that imagination, thinking about solutions, but under the same system that has led us to where we are right now. And we need to move beyond that. And to move beyond that means feminist thought, for example, is a very powerful tool or methodology, if you can say so, to protect life, to know how to imagine new horizons, to create systems of inequality and to start where we are right now. And there is, I think that another thing that I want to say is that we need to change the narrative to be able to push for the solutions that Bobby and Bill are mentioning. And to change that narrative, we need to also be careful for those of us who are already convinced that climate crisis is the biggest deal of all right now. We need to be careful of not falling into absolutist thinking, meaning that either we work in it and we get to zero emissions, or we just leave things where they are and we tend to think in catastrophic terms. I think that there's many examples of grassroots movements already providing for these alternatives. Global Green Grants Fund, for example, is very lucky to be able to hold so many stories of change. We need to make sure that those stories of change are spread out everywhere. That they enthusiastically bring people into thinking that these are actually the solutions that we want to create. And for example, Germany and Boulder are great examples of legislature being able to pass. And this is all because people got fed up of corporate power, of not being able to share any of the profits from the energy industry. And this is something that lets me to believe that it is possible. You know, it's just a matter of pushing and modifying the narrative to be able to then continue with the list that Bobby provided to us.
Thank you, Laura. Yeah, I think it's really important, and you've all addressed it, to think about, and for our audience to think about, that we really do have most of the solutions that we need for climate change and to stop the climate chaos. And as, again, going back to Catherine Wilkinson and Ayanna Johnson's anthology, All We Can Save, they mention this, and that we just need to remove barriers to these solutions, as you all have addressed, and really accelerate their implementation. Bobby, going back to something that you said earlier, can you talk more about the meaning of open democracy for the world and for our audience, and why that's so critical to what we're talking about today?
Yeah, firstly, I think a true democracy and an open democracy is a messy democracy. Democracy is not neat. It's not linear. You don't walk into a voting station, you make your vote, and then the world comes out better. It's about engaging in your democracy and about allowing, or for the system to allow you to engage in your democracy. And I think for many poor people around the world, within the US, within Europe, within the global South, there is no true democracy, because the democracy is only for those that can afford it, in a way. And in South Africa, we had a type of honeymoon period in 1994 to 1999, where there was this opening of a democracy, where there was a debate about having an open democracy, not only a democracy where you vote, but a democracy where you can legitimately challenge and engage. And I think that is what is missing in our system today, globally. To be able to get a just transition and to be able to respond to climate change, you have to have a democracy that allows people to engage and disagree. And you know, there's no absolute truth. It's going to be a push and a shove, and you know, in certain places, what we think will work won't work, and that's fine. But unless we have that practice of being open about how we engage, so that everybody can engage, you know, it's not going to be meaningful. And that is simple. This really means the practice of me and you being able to walk into a committee meeting in Washington without us being held back, with me being able to walk into a committee meeting in Parliament in Cape Town without being held back, or into the mayor's office. And those things that were possible, you see, they're not impossible. They are there. It did happen. Have been taken away. And I think that's what we really need to fight for, as an open democracy. And remember, it's going to be messy.
Thank you, Bobby. Bill, I want to go back to you. as important as it is to talk about true solutions for climate change and some of the things that we've been discussing, it's also important to discuss the false ones. And they're essential to address because billions of dollars, mind power, immense amount of time, which we don't have, could be diverted to misguided ideas that could at worst have even more devastating effects to our planet and at best shift the focus from where it really needs to go. Can you talk to our audience about some of these false solutions, why you see them as detrimental, and what are the most important alternative solutions to focus on?
Well, when we're talking about energy, I mean, look, this is obviously enormously difficult and complicated. We're taking the thing that's driven the global economy for 2 centuries, fossil fuel, and trying to replace it on the fly with something else. So there's no getting around the fact that it's difficult and complex and expensive and but in the most general terms, what we need to do is stop lighting things on fire. And one of the big false solutions that people are coming up with in too many parts of the world is the substitution of big industrial scale biomass, cutting down forests and putting them into power plants. And that's a perfect example of, how not to think about this. Just because you happen to own a big power plant and now you can't put coal on it anymore because everybody's figured out that's going to wreck the world is not a good reason to then stick trees in it instead, because we understand A, the damage that does to the forests and the people who live with them, and B, the fact that it doesn't work out in carbon terms either, because you're pouring carbon into the atmosphere in the short run, and it'll be a very long time before forests soak it back up. So the thing that, in the grossest possible terms, the largest possible terms, what we have to do is rely on the fact that there is a large fire burning 90 million miles away. And we're capable of taking the effects of the sun and using them to do what we need to do. That's solar panels and that's wind turbines that, both of which draw their power ultimately from the sun. And it's not that these things are magic, that they don't come without cost, that we don't need to be careful about how we do them, so on and so forth. It's that in the emergency that we're in, the thing we have on hand that we can build at speed, providing far more jobs than the fossil fuel economy ever provided, and hopefully allowing as much as possible the ownership of those assets as close to home as possible. That strikes me as one of the real possibilities for the time ahead, that we're able to transform that ownership of this large part of our economic system from the few people who happen to sit atop the deposits of coal and gas and oil around the world, all of whom become oligarchs without, with way too much power in our world, whether it's the king of Saudi Arabia or the Koch brothers in the US or whoever it is. Replace that with communities able to have some control over the one of their 2 or 3 most important commodities, energy, because the sun and wind that are providing it are close to home.
Thank you, Bill. We're going to open it to the audience in just a second. We have a couple of minutes, and really briefly, because I think this is important, can you all just spend a few seconds talking about or addressing, it will take everyone to address climate change, every single member of our audience. There are 153 people out there listening, but it also, to many, can feel overwhelming. We've been talking about just transitions and systems change and all of these, and movements and all of these really critical pieces. But I think to the individual person dealing with COVID and dealing with so many things in their lives, what would your message be to the audience, to our young people, to everyone out there about what they can do? Bobby, do you want to?
Yeah. I mean, way back in the 90s and in the 80s, there was this big debate around consumption, and And somehow that debate is no more on the table. We cannot continue consuming the energy we have and expect that wind and solar is going to respond effectively to that. No, the biggest challenge we have is for those that are over-consuming to use less, so that those that really need it just have enough to be able to live day to day. And I think that's it. We have lost the consumption debate and the efficiency debate to an extent, but not as bad as a consumption debate over the last decade. And I think that really needs to be brought back onto the table, because it's the global north that still consume, but critically, they are the middle classes and the elite in the south that are doing just as much damage as the north is doing to their brothers and sisters in the south.
Thank you, Bobby. Lara or Bill, you want to jump in, Lara?
Sure. Perhaps something that's important is well, first of all, to inform yourselves. I think it's very important to start understanding more deeply what are those real solutions as opposed to those false solutions that Bill was mentioning. One that has, for example, sequestered almost entire international negotiations on the climate crisis is about population. And we need to think about that, because I still hear many people think that the rising population is what we need to control, and therefore point towards sub-Saharan Africa, for example, where we need to actually delve deeply and inform ourselves. But it's not only about information. I think it's also about the emotional courage to think what we need to change in ourselves, as opposed to looking at the problem far away and the solutions far away from us. So the solutions that are false are those solutions that we think that our lives can stay without any modification, and that people in Africa just need to have less babies, for example, where we actually need to feel that it is up to us. But it's not only up to us as citizens with regards to our own consumption and the choices that we create, but our citizen participation and really ensuring that modes of direct democracy are practiced and therefore defended and oiled every day. And this is also very important. I think that Bobby's message on direct democracy is extremely important, because in every country, it doesn't matter how historical democratic institutions have been, like the USA, for example, we know that democracy cannot be taken for granted. I think that we learned that lesson quite dramatically over these last 4 years. But that citizen participation, citizen organizing has been at the core of social change in our history. There have been no women's rights and no social rights without people pushing for them and winning them. So if that is the case, we have therefore something to do there. And it is up to us to organize, it is up to us to practice those, to defend those democratic institutions, and to be brave enough to understand that we have been sequestered in our imagination to think about other possible solutions and alternatives. And there are alternatives, and it is possible.
Thank you, Laura. Bill,
I would just say, I think everything what everybody's saying is correct. Here's one way to think about it, especially in the highly individualized Western world. The most important thing an individual can do at this point may be to be a little bit less of an individual and join together with others in movements big enough to really alter economic and political ground rules. That only happens when you get large enough numbers of people to serve as a counterweight to the huge vested interest and the huge amount of inertia that there is in the system. That's why I spend my time trying to organize. I think it's the most important thing.
Thank you, Bill. And going to some questions to the audience, one of the members says, I appreciate Mr. Peak bringing up the need for a complete change in our energy system. Mr. McKibben talks about timing, and there are a lot of questions here about energy too. And so I think this is a good one to focus on. Do we have time to create a new energy system? And if so, what are the most important things to do right away to move this forward? Who wants to take that one, Bobby or Bill or Lara?
Yeah, I think we have time. I think that's really important to recognize. And time also means, as we've been discussing over the last short few minutes, is about how do we reduce our consumption, and that really means about thinking. You can't just shift from fossil fuel to renewable. Shifting to a brand new Tesla does not save the planet. If you look at the Tesla, it's where's it mined, all the plastic that's in it, it is still causing climate change.
Yeah, and a sort of good way to think about that is, exciting as a Tesla looks, an electric bus is a lot more important for a lot of reasons. Because there's no good reason for anyone to be breathing diesel smoke at this point, and because we need to be able to move people, communally, and because buses are gregarious and their people are talking with each other and doing the work of, building the work of communities. We don't have much time, and it is always worth remembering that this is a political question, unlike others, because of that timing question. Dr. King would always say at the end of speeches, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice, which I think meant basically, this may take a while, but we're going to win in the end. The arc of the physical universe is short, and it bends toward heat. And if we don't win pretty quickly in terms of transforming energy systems and consumption and things, then the effects, I'm afraid the effects of kind of really unmitigated climate change are going to be so great that they overwhelm everything else we're trying to do in the world. That all we'll be doing is kind of emergency response to the next round of fires or hurricanes or whatever the hell it is. So the key, I think, is to build this new energy system very fast and to build it in ways that help change the balance of power around our world, so that it no longer rests with people who happen to have control over scarce supply of fossil fuels, so that it instead rests with democracies, with people who have control over the things they need for their own lives. And that's a hard, that's obviously not easy, any of that, but that's what we've got to be pushing for. And we do have the opportunity that's afforded by the need for speed, that allows us probably to think on larger scales than we get to in normal times. I mean, this is an emergency, and so in emergencies, sometimes you get to operate more effectively than you do in normal time.
Absolutely. Thank you, Bill and Bobby. Another question is, I'm wondering how we may be able to leverage the political moment, especially in the US, to bring more people along and recognizing the false promises of neoliberal capitalism.
Just as an American, I live in Vermont, so I'm a Bernie Sanders guy. We need a lot of that. And it's much closer to the surface than it's been in a long time in this country. And I think it's really easy even to look at the Biden administration and realize that they've been changed by the last 3 or 4 years, not only of Trump, but of the rise of Bernie and the rise of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and things like that. people are talking in deeper terms than they have in the past. It's not easy, and it won't be easy. And I have a great deal of compassion for Joe Biden trying to figure out how to make big change in the middle of all kinds of crises and with a country that's bitterly divided. And, you know, in some ways, that's a stand-in for the whole world too, in terms of division and inertia and vested interest. But there are the fact that, you know, Bernie Sanders is the single most liked politician in the United States is a good sign that these ideas are not only not beyond the pale, they could be the wellspring for a lot of political activity going forward.
Thank you, Bill. Laura or Bobby, do you want to weigh in on that question?
Sure. Well, again, my caveat is that I'm Mexican, but I'm currently living here and in the US. And I will start with the meme that went around the world of Bernie Sanders sitting with his gloves and being really kind of like an opposite image of this, you know, this story that I was telling you about, you know, heroes conquering political power and kind of romanticizing all of that. And Bernie was just there sitting. And for me, it's a very nice image of and a very endearing one as well. I know that people were mostly using that meme to laugh, and that perhaps can be a point of conversation and criticism of why that created humor. But for me, it created this enormous idea of how we need to think about problems in the world and how we need to think about solutions. And it's really much less about thinking that the climate crisis will be solved by this heroic story of one big technological solution coming there and making it pretty, instead of really about stories like Bernie Sanders and Stacey Abrams in the US, you know, about the power of grassroots movements that are much more about not showing really a story about single heroes, but much more about collective organizing and day-to-day struggling to protect and to cherish what we have as humans and to look at life in much more simple terms. And I think that for me creates a lot of hope in the US, because we are creating images, for example, in the toppling of monuments or in the taking a knee, that can create a very symbolic image of what we need to do to turn everything around. It's much less about understanding where the technology is. I think that scientists are there to help us do that, and it's necessary, obviously, to continue protecting science and protecting reality in a post-truth world. But it's much more about that being together with grassroots movements organizing the way that Stacey Abrams showed us that you can really turn a whole political system around with the power of people just organizing themselves and fighting for their rights. And climate change is really much more about that than about these false or technological solutions that do not really question our modes of life. And that's why they are easy to think about. It's easy to, or I would say lazy, to imagine that the solution will come out like a vaccine, because it's not like that. We need to not think that there's going to be a sort of vaccine to help us through the climate crisis. We need to restructure ourselves and our modes of life, and that requires courage, strength, and imagination. And we need to understand that the grassroots movements are showing us precisely that courage, strength, and imagination.
Thank you, Lara. We have 1 more minute before we have to close, and I think there's a lot of questions among the audience and people in general about what are the sort of energy solutions that are okay. For example, one member in our audience asks about nuclear energy. What are people feeling about nuclear energy? Is that a true solution or something that we should be moving away from? I wanted to bring that up as the last question before we end.
Well, I'll just say quickly, lay aside these questions we've discussing about centralization of power and so on. Lay aside everything you know about the particular dangers that come with nuclear power. And I think the reason it's not going to be a big part of the solution, and we shouldn't spend too much time obsessing over it, is it's incredibly expensive. The price of power from the sun and the wind has gone like this for the last 10 years. The price of a nuclear power plant just keeps going up and up and up. Unless you can convince the government to subsidize it at huge levels, or unless you have a military that's really eager to have it for some other reason that probably not a very happy one, we're better off relying on the very large nuclear reactor stationed 90 million miles away to provide what we need.
Thank you, Bill. Bobby, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, any solution that is centralized, that is going to rely on somebody else, 2,000 kilometers away, is not the solution. And I agree with Bill in terms of the finances. It's just stupid. So the social ownership of renewable energy is about the decentralization and the ownership of that at a very local level. And you have to be in control of your own energy and your own system if you want to make a change.
With that in mind, I'm going to ask one more question and then I'll speak really quickly with the closing remarks, because I think this is important because it's also addressing questions that we're getting from the audience. Is given the size of the world, the number of people, we've talked about the need to cut consumption dramatically, and we're looking at wind and sun as new energy solutions. Is that enough? Is that something? And nuclear, we just discussed that is not a reliable. Are the energy solutions, the regenerative energy solutions that we have on the table, and many people are asking about the sun and the wind, but we've been talking about locally led solutions, regenerative economies, regenerative agriculture, and that sort of thing. But how would you address the massive scale that we need the energy compared with what we're talking about in terms of solar and wind and the other things that we've discussed? And we have about 2 minutes for this.
Well, just in physical terms, enough solar energy falls on the planet every day to power the planet for a year. It's not, that's not the issue. There's, it's not that we're short of, there's some physical shortage, but trying to figure out how to reduce our demands enough on systems so that we are able to take some reasonable percentage of what God is giving us and turn it to good use. Those are big questions that have less to do with solar power and more to do with economic and political power. And that's why that's where that falls. But no one should be worried that the world that there's not that. The sun's going to be there for 1 billion years, and it's a large and powerful thing, and we've got good brains that can help us make good use of it if we figure out how to do it in a way that helps people instead of in a way that just continues the same unfair world that we've been existing in.
Absolutely, Bill, thank you. And Bobby, I see you're off mute. Did you want to add to that?
I don't know, something different. Go ahead, Laura. Yeah.
I would just perhaps end by saying that we tend to think that climate justice as a concept has been brought more or less like, some people anyway, more or less for more like humanitarian purposes. Like, let's make a just transition because there's people in need and we need that. And that is completely false, in my view. It's a faulty way of thinking, because really what justice brings to the climate crisis movement is much more about providing true solutions, even energetic solutions, because again, like Bobby and Bill have been saying, it's not just about how to understand in technological ways the transfer of energy, but how to do it in a world where that problem is much more to do with political and social systems that we have. And because it's trapped right there, because the solutions are trapped in those political and social systems, it's not a scientific problem per se. It's a problem that involves all of our mode of living, all of our mode of producing food, for example, etc., and corporate power. We really require the justice aspect of it, because social justice movements have brought solutions to understand how to topple power, and that for me is a great motor that we need in the climate crisis movement.
Laura, thank you. It's a great way to end. And unfortunately, we didn't get to all the audience questions. I want to thank you for joining us today, and a special thank you to our speakers who have volunteered their time to be with us. If you'd like to support them and learn more about their work, you can find their books, podcasts, and social media accounts links to the CWA website. Preparations are already underway for CWA 2021, and the CWA relies on the generosity of people like you to make this event possible. Please consider making a gift to the CWA, which can be done on the CWA website, www.colorado.edu/CWA. And if you enjoyed the panel today, there are 2 others in the series this Wednesday at 2 p.m. Mountain Standard Time, China's Future and Its Impact on the World Stage, as well as Friday at 9 Mountain Standard Time on foreign policy called US Friend or Foe. You can RSVP for these events on the CWA website. And thank you all again for joining us. And now we all have good work to do, and onwards. Bobby, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can. Great.
Thank you for that, Bill. We'll talk soon.
Cool, man. Take care.
Okay, bye.